Okay, Tim, good morning.
Good morning.
And hello, everyone who's listening in. It's been about 6 years since we did one of these things, Tim. I can feel the rust on my body just wearing off as I settle back into it. But we used to call them the Deep Awake dialogues, where I'd ask you about different aspects of your work or maybe something totally random altogether. And we're going to shift back into one today, partly because, partly because I saw you a couple of months ago, went to one of your retreats. That was great. And you've got a pod book coming out, a book that is recorded in audio format, where you've been developing a lot of ideas over, I'm going to say 8 years now. And I think that's probably the longest gap in your writing career where there has not been a substantial piece of work come out. And yeah, I thought it might be interesting. I know a lot of people have done this, but I thought it might be interesting if I sat down and asked you about the development of those ideas going way back, really, this sort of intellectual journey. So to get that ball rolling then, I think you've expressed a lot in interviews about your spiritual journey, if you like, and your journey of inner conscious experiences that shifted your perception and led you to setting up these workshops that you run, which hundreds, if not 1,000 people have attended now and had, from what I've seen, very positive experiences on them. And that roots back a lot to the experience you tell of being a teenage boy and having this big love experience arise spontaneously on a hill where, okay, there's more to life than what we see. And then you're off through a journey of Western monasticism to Eastern Advaita Vedanta and everything in between. Advaita to Zen, A to Z, and everything in between. There we go. Um, Going alongside that, okay, and you might want to say some words about that just in case anyone, hasn't heard of that. But going alongside that, there must also be, right from that point, an intellectual journey, specifically around metaphysics. That you're growing up in a society which is part Christian and has that God at the beginning kind of metaphysical position, and you're growing up in a society which is heavily scientific and has the something close to nothing at the beginning, and then it all gets bigger from there. And then you're having all these Eastern spiritual ideas flooding into the landscape too. So, can you describe going like way back, wherever you want to start it from? What was the metaphysics for you that has evolved and accompanied through your life, and the major kind of early shifts in that?
Oh, what a fantastic question to start with. That is a great question, Richard. So that definitely happened, but also I would say when I look at my journey that the emphasis right up until my 30s was primarily on experience. So that there was a metaphysical journey, and I was always curious and inquiring, but it was very much secondary. So it was kind of I could draw from anywhere because it didn't really matter if they didn't quite fit together because the experience is what I was interested in. So what happened to me when I was young was sitting on a hill, like you said, I was 12, 13, and bang, suddenly I was in this other place, this altered state, and this profound experience of the universe is full of love. And I interpreted it with the metaphysical ideas I had at the time, which was, oh, this is God. I was told God is love. Here it is. And I suspect the fact that I had been told that may have also affected the experience I was having. I think those interact. I wasn't thinking any of that at the time. What impressed me was the power of the experience. And so it then became about how can I get back to the experience and how can I how can I share it as well straight away as well? How can I explore this and explore it with others? And so I was drawing on everything. And what was coming through at that time was ideas like Huxley, Aldous Huxley had expressed quite a long time before that, of there is a perennial philosophy. And the metaphysical idea that grabbed me was there are key experiences human beings can have. People have had them in all cultures at all times, and they've understood them in different ways. So the understanding is secondary. What matters is the experience. So the fact that they seem to contradict each other or see things in different ways, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the experience itself. And so that's why I found myself being able to draw on all these things. That did change. I started to care about the metaphysics, but not to begin with.
I'm curious because I think my life, I went through a pattern which is almost archetypal, right? You just hear so many people have the same kind of story of being raised in a nominally Christian culture where there might not have been a hardcore theology to it, but God exists. He's this big, all-loving being, and He created the world so we could all enjoy ourselves and love each other and love Him. And it's nice, right? It's a nice story when I'm growing up. There's this big, all-loving being that's taking care of everything. It doesn't. It always gave me a problem because it didn't necessarily comport well to watching the evening news, like because I had a very nice life and well, probably live in one of the nicest places in the world, right? But it's just then there's like horror shows going on um around the world, and that was always like strange to me. But then and this is the archetypal part, there is a falling away of that into bumping up against materialist science. Okay. And there's a, oh, this doesn't quite fit because God, he was up there, but now space is up there. It's like above us only sky. Okay. So there's and then the feeling maybe a bit silly, like a bit, oh, I've bought into all these silly mythological notions, becoming a bit of a crusade for wanting to get away from that and embracing a kind of atheistic position. And then finding a kind of hollowness to that at some point, a kind of spiritually kind of breath, or what does anything really matter if we're just piles of atoms walking around talking to each other? There's no one in here even having those conversations. And then spiritual experiences arising, which probably pushed me back, at least initially, into that, interpreting them inside of that Christian framework, which may have also influenced the nature in which they arose. And I think that is just, I could take the bones of that story and apply it to just so many people, and you'll have met so many people like that who go through that kind of that loop. But
But I
I'm
didn't.
not sure that. Hmm?
But I didn't.
No, I'm not. No, I'm just saying that I'm not sure that applies to you. And I think it's maybe
No.
interesting for people to know that you weren't wrestling with ideas of materialist science. And
No,
oh,
I,
well,
I
this raised
think
me.
to begin with, Richard, I just felt from very early on because because the experiences that were happening to me in my teenage years, and there was lots of them, I kind of simply dismissed it. It's much later in life that I went, oh, this is amazing. Let me understand this. Let me go deeply into it. My initial response was, this cannot help me. My feeling from being at school was science was about understanding how iron filings move about. It's not going to tell me the meaning of life.
Right.
And so it was a practical, it was about the mechanics of the universe. Whereas what I was interested in was the meaning of my existence, and particularly about how I could move into these states in which everything didn't make sense, but there was this sublime feeling of connection and love. That was the impulse.
So that's. I mean, other people find this interesting. I find that interesting knowing you because in my time knowing you, you've always been someone who's come across as quite excited and animated about the scientific project.
Yeah,
Okay, and I'm talking the past 20 years here.
yeah.
Whereas for me as a teenager, my like I suppose metaphysical and spiritual yearnings were, I tried to satiate them through science initially and through physics particularly, and because I thought, okay, this is really getting into the fundamentals of existence. Okay, like what are atoms? What are these things like electrons? What is charge? And what are these properties? And um, we had this physics teacher at school who my friends still have a laugh about to this day. When he talked about quantum physics, he it sounded like a 1950s professor giving a sex education talk where he was very awkward. It's a dirty business, lads. Let's just, a particle can be a wave can be a particle. Don't like it. I don't understand it. Let's just move on. And so he really wasn't metaphysically interested, right? So, and then when I found spirituality, there was a kind of like, oh, I've been going down completely the wrong path with this science stuff. That's not what the fundamental is. What's witnessing this? It's consciousness. It's not the material suburb. So and that left me, and I think you do find this in spirituality. There's a kind of distaste for science sometimes,
Yes.
maybe legitimately, in that our scientific institutions are not always the purest of the pure. They can be as corrupted as our religious institutions became, but also maybe illegitimately, and there is that kind of like bad taste for it, and that was certainly like left in my mouth. So it's interesting to understand that almost going for that later, you didn't have that, and you had this different.
I didn't have the attraction to find out really what it was about because it didn't address the issue that was the most important for me. So that um, it just felt like that's nothing to do with this thing that I'm experiencing. It's to do with something else. So it wasn't only, it was much later in life that I went, oh, this is amazing. So to begin with, it's like spiritual experience. Here's all these different traditions. I want to understand them all. I want to go and learn with teachers of them all. I want to find out the commonality of experience in them all. and develop some rough idea like, oh, I see the purpose of my life is to be enlightened or to know God or whatever particular way of saying it that you've got. But there was also always, I mean, I've always been inquiring and I've always, been fascinated by different ideas. So I did eventually get attracted to going to university, studying philosophy, really understanding what the hell that is. Although, to be honest, it wasn't a spiritual motivation. It was a political motivation that took me to university, which is
never do that. Right.
an irony for me, but true. I was, at that point, I was trying to understand how this feeling of universal benevolence, let's call it, that was arising in these states, how would that transfer to how we might run society, and what would that be? And so an engagement of it as well. It wasn't just another worldliness. And that led me to want to understand Marx in particular, because there was a vision of utopia being offered. And so it's like, what's that? What's that? I'm a young man. I'm in my teens still. I'm in late teens going, well, that seems interesting. What is it? And then that led me to go to university and study and go, right, I need to understand Western philosophy and train my mind. And that was a big shift, because then it was like, right, I really need to be able to think clearly. And it really did teach me to think clearly. That's one thing I got. I found the philosophy I was studying completely useless, in all honesty. But the ability, and I became obnoxious, I would say. That's probably the right word. I became like a philosophical buccaneer. It was like, right, give me your ideas and I'll just, right, yeah, done, next. What's your ideas? Huh. And develop that ability to sharply just cut things to pieces. But that was horrible. But it was good for me to be able to do that to myself. And that's what I've been doing to myself ever since.
Okay, so then I find that really interesting that your intellectual side was almost satiated in this different form of political philosophy, and then you've got the spiritual side, which is at that time at least more experiential. And I want to fast forward to the point where you did start to think intellectually more about metaphysical questions. I am just curious to ask, when you're talking about developing a way to think, were there any particular, well, okay, so you're saying you developed a really good way to think, but the philosophy was useless in itself, it didn't appeal to you. But were there any philosophers particularly that influenced at that time your methodology around thinking?
There was philosophers I was impressed with, of course, but I basically I had the same problem that, by the time I was finishing my degree, and I'm very young still, early 20s, I did take time off. I didn't go straight to university, so there's a delay. I'm older than most of the people there, but I'm still young. I'm having another spate of spontaneous awakenings happen on a whole new level. And so, my vivid memory of sitting in a class on the logical proofs for the existence of God. And I'm sitting there experiencing God, and just, I can hardly contain myself from just the laughter I'm feeling at the kind of bizarreness of it all, that we're going, oh, does this prove the existence? And I'm there thinking, so that undercut all of it. I mean, I very nearly didn't finish the degree for that reason. It was like, oh, well, this isn't going to help. And that led me into a pattern which you see a lot in spirituality, which is, oh, thinking isn't going to do it. Ideas aren't going to do it. I just need to meditate, or I just need to be in these states. Then that led me to retreat completely, which I'd done already once, but I retreated again for about a year into just looking at it experientially. And I took no books with me. I read so many books when I was studying and before, but I really, really did take in the philosophical canon. I mean, I just ate it. And then when I withdrew, I took no books with me apart from The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And my vivid memory is with this one book in this little cottage with no furniture around a little fire, just like reduced everything to the bare minimum in a kind of monastic way, I suppose, mimicking that, and reading this book and him going, it cannot be found through words, and me thinking, well, there's no point in reading this then, and throwing the book onto the fire. And that was the last book I read for ages. So it was a complete paring down into something which is very common in spirituality, which is like, oh, all of these ideas and thinking is just in the way.
Yeah, that's almost a parallel there, actually, because I nearly went to university to do some sort of religious experience degree down in Kent when I was in my early to mid 20s. And then the advisor thing opened up and I started to have these deep inner conscious experiences. It was quite rough for a while, actually. So well, that I didn't start, I finished. I didn't start the degree in the end. I just did that instead. So I think I'd probably be happier with that, actually. I'm glad I didn't start. So let's jump in then. Where does it arise that these metaphysical questions start to not be something that's impeding your spirituality, but something that becomes intellectually interesting for you? And what do you gravitate towards in terms of the idealist, materialist, theist, atheist spectrum? Where do you go with that when you do jump in?
So I think up until my 30s, I'm just happy to dip into this and dip into that and take up this view and go, look, I can see it like this. That's nice. And no problem now. I can, I can live in the monastery, which I did, and see it like this. And, but this overall feeling of these are just ways of trying to approach something ineffable. And if I step into it, I can have this experience. Or I step into that, I can have that experience. So I absolutely get when people do that, because I did that for a long time. That I really changed in terms of like seeing it in a particular way with the experiential discovery of Advaita Vedanta. And for me, that came through Nisargadatta Maharaj. And for reasons I still haven't, I don't know why. I came across an extract from I Am That in the back of another book when I was working with the dying. My manual for that was Who Dies by Stephen Levine.
Mm.
And in the back of it, he's got a section from, as I remember it, from I Am That. And for something about it just went, what's this? And I had to order it from India. It wasn't published in the West at all. And this book arrived from India, and I just ate it up. In fact, I bought copies for all my friends. I was so impressed. It was like, and that was like, my feeling was, here is a way of understanding this. And it was the next level. It was so much pushing me further. It was like, no. What you've been playing at is, you've been playing in the shallows, Tim. This is the really deep stuff. And from that, I had another, what seemed like a spontaneous experience of not being a person. And that opened up that journey then to start exploring the idea of, I see, everything's in consciousness. What I am is that presence of the I. Tim is just an appearance within consciousness. My identification with Tim is in the way of me seeing what I really am, and then experiences opening up around that. And I began to feel like, this is a deeper level. And I would follow that through. Years later in the Jesus Mysteries, I would see that as a transition between the psychic and the pneumatic stages of initiation. That was my jump into a much more radical way of seeing things. And then because I stepped into that and started viewing all of these traditions that I was studying and now writing about, now that was a big difference as well. Before, I was just playing for myself, and suddenly I was being asked to write on Sufism, write on Zen, and so I was being forced to clarify, well, what is this saying? And are they saying the same thing, or is it different? And if they are saying the same thing, what is it? And I saw all of that through the lens of idealism, of it's all in consciousness, that this was a common thread, and starting to articulate that in these different traditions. And it was later when I found problems with that for me that I became more and more engrossed in, okay, how do we understand this? And started to see also that the way we understand it has a big impact on how you experience it. That it's not just like the pure experience that doesn't exist. And so that was when it really kicked off. So 30s, long time ago now, still.
Hmm. Okay, so I think I met you when you were in your 40s and doing these events, and there was definitely an idealist metaphysics underpinning them, but it wasn't pushed ever. Like, people turned up who were atheists or had different kind of religious beliefs, and that was
Yeah,
all
yeah,
fine, right? And if someone had rejected the idea that it's all in consciousness or something, it's not like that would have caused a hoo-ha. It was all, but there was
yeah,
this kind of soft idealism
yeah.
underpinning it. And
A
then
soft idealism. I like that. That's exactly right. Yeah.
and then the criticisms I saw you evolve into were really, I think, speaking to the problems people were having of having perhaps wonderful spiritual experiences that were getting them going on this path, or whether that's a big, direct, immediate experience or something they're gradually stepping into, and that kind of toxifying at some point, and
Yep.
finding this Eastern path around Advaita Vedanta, which I also, to this day, think it gives the clearest expression of that position. Like the Sufi writing might be very beautiful and all the rest, but Advaita philosophically really speaks to me. Zen I never really understand. So, um, so then there's this emergence of something which I don't think in any way conflicts with an idealist mind-only position, but you have this idea of like both and arising. So
Yep. Yep.
yes, you are this big consciousness, but also let's value the individual actor on the stage, the dream character you're playing. And that seemed to be a massive shift in terms of the health of the experience.
Yep.
Like I'm attending your events, I never saw anyone come away with like truly bad experiences that were long lasting. And okay, there was a couple of times that maybe which we're well aware of. Okay, and that I think also formulated the direction you were going. But there's nothing that really in that stage going through your writings through the noughties that really conflict with idealism. At the same time, when I meet you, you're very interested in the scientific project then. So I'm just looking at that period prior to writing Soul Story, where the doubt kind of creeps in terms of at some point, I think you must have realized that there are these two different narratives. Okay, that you, in the one hand, you have this big mind that's there at the beginning, and it's all love, and it's dreaming the cosmos into existence. And in another narrative, you have this very simple start to the universe, where more and more complexity evolves until biological life forms come along, and then they evolve. So you seem to have something that's, well, in the Gnostic sense, top down, of creation starts at its most complete and then falls. There's a
Yep.
descent into matter, and then you have the scientific narrative of matter ascending into consciousness.
Yep.
And I wonder when that contrast kind of struck you for the first time that, oh, how do we have to stitch these two together?
Yeah, these are great questions. Really interesting to try and remember. So, yeah, you're right. I had the both thing. The both and thing came quite quickly, really. I wasn't in the whole more extreme Advaitic position for very long at all. It took a while for me to really get it, but I was looking for how to articulate. And I think that comes because of the eclecticism of my past. You know, one of my mentors was a Franciscan friar called Brother Bernard, and he would always keep returning me to the personal and the value of the personal. And I, you know, at the time that I was most into Ramesh Balsekar and Nisargadatta, it was like, oh, he just doesn't get it. And then gradually I began to realize that I didn't really get it and that he did get it, and that I needed to integrate these two, and came up with what was eventually lucid living, a simple metaphor for how it can be both. With the emphasis really that you are still really consciousness. I mean, in lucid living, I still have the line, which was the big line for me from Nisargadatta, "You are not a person," is one of the insights. So that's a pretty full-on thing, and I incorporate it because it just hits you right between the eyes and pushes you into that other state. But it was still like, no, but the individual is important, and the individual is how you get there. But before that, right back to the Gnostics, I was becoming more and more. The scientific project really attracted me via the evolutionary picture. That was my route into it. That I was coming across Ken Wilber, for example, was a key player, I think, for me and so many. I'm going, yeah, this evolutionary picture, this is amazing and really makes sense. So I set out really to integrate the idea of the evolutionary picture with idealism. And that felt like something you could do, and it's being done a lot at the moment. A lot of scientists themselves have tried it, which is you have a spiritual view of what this is essentially, but the journey in the appearances is the evolutionary story. So it's science within spirituality in that way. It's all consciousness, but what's arising is evolution. And that explains how they fit together. So I tried that and was happy with that for a while. And then when I really started expanding the both and in the mystery experience, and that's an interesting one because it's still called the mystery experience. So it's like all my influences are there. They're just not, they don't quite fit together. I tried to make them. There's the idea of what really matters is just the experience. That's what really matters. And it's a mystery. So that's the starting place. But as we do need to understand things as well, because it's both and, how can we understand it? And then suggesting, look, there's these two ways of seeing it, exactly as you said. There's the idea it's all in consciousness, which so it's fundamentally subjective, or it's all matter. It's fundamentally objective. And you can see it either way. It's a both and thing. They kind of fit together in a paradoxical way that you can just jump between the two. So that's what I attempted then at that stage. And then it was only after that that I began to go, that was the journey before Soul Story, which is when I started. And even in Soul Story, I hadn't gone the whole way that I have now, of going, this is not really fitting together. And there's a simpler, more elegant narrative that I'm beginning to glimpse. And one of the problems for me with the version I had before was that it wasn't dealing with things like the survival of the soul after death adequately. It wasn't dealing with my experience of the magic of the universe adequately. There were things which were not accounting for my actual experience. And so I was willing to stop and push, which is what I've been doing ever since, to go to see if there was a better way of getting this. And then what happened with Soul Story was I started to almost like catch the scent of something new. And the more I went into it, although it was incredibly hard work, the better it got, and the better it got, and that's what we had again since Soul Story for the last 8 years. I can't believe it. Wherever I focus on a problem and I spend my whole time going, yeah, but to myself, more insight would come, and it's still happening every day. I mean, that's what the reason my pod book, I'm going to share all this for free on the internet, but the reason it hasn't arrived yet is it's still happening. I hope it will stop enough soon that I can do it. And that's what's kept me pulling into something which just seems so beautiful and so elegant and so simple in its essence, but explanatory of such complexity, that the others have all fallen away now and just feel like, yeah, no, not that, this.
So would you say that was a collapsing of a more pluralistic approach where what reality is comes down to perspective? So if I look over here, it's material, a material unit or anything, or I could shift my perspective and look over here and it's a consciousness-based mind universe that's arising. And then there's a condensing of that in Soul Story where that kind of collapsed or resolved into one position. Would that be an accurate way of...
I think so. I think that's how it started. So I think the ability, the pure pluralistic view is I think it's a very mature ability to have, where you realize, oh, look, I can see it in this way. I can experience, and not only, and even more so when you get, oh, I can experience it in this way. So for instance, I find it interesting that I can move, because I'm familiar with both, between a version of this moment where I'm the presence of awareness within which all of these experiences are arising. And now I can flip that around, and now I'm this body in a room looking around at an objective world. And once being able to see things in that way in which you see, it's not just that you can understand it in different ways, but you can experience it in different ways. I think that's an amazing step for anyone to make. But I think it's a transitory step into one of integration. Whereas what you're looking for, ultimately what I'm looking for, is how do those different views integrate in a way in which I see what's happening here? So how can I understand the fact that I can slip between those two, for instance? What is that? That's so, and that's what I've been looking for, is a way of integrating this into one understanding. And that means also, so integrating ultimately all of that scientific knowledge which I've acquired now with all my spiritual experience, which seems so very, very important.
Right. I mean, there must be, I think, a danger of that, right? Because, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I adopt a pluralistic approach in a lot of what I'm doing, whether it's metaphysics, to the extent I do that, or a lot of like historical writing. And I'm always encountering people who tell me I'm wrong to do that. And overwhelmingly, I think it's because they found their own perspective compelling. Like they've been drawn into it so strongly that they cannot see that there is another perspective on this. And, I write a lot about conspiracy theory. in the sense of, because I find it fascinating that people see the world. Two things I find fascinating: that people see the world in totally oppositional ways, and that they have no ability to make that transition, that they're completely locked in. I find these that area. So things like why radically different interpretations of history arise are interesting. So, but it really
So,
what
so go on, Richard. Sorry,
Oh,
didn't mean to
I'll
interrupt.
finish off.
Yeah, I
What
didn't
I
mean to interrupt.
what I always want to do is obviously collapse pluralism and say, it is this and not that. Okay, and usually that doesn't happen, because usually like things are very complex, and I had to say, well, if you look at it this way, it's like this. If you look at it that way, it's like that, and we're going to have to be happy with a greater understanding without coming to a conclusion. And I did a whole series on the First World War. Okay, and it was a lot of, well, we could say it was this reason that started it. We could say it was that. But one area where I got very excited was the Russian Revolution, because I was able to, in my mind, at least identify some of the explanations of the Russian Revolution that float around in the internet as being Tsarist propaganda, as being like the old guard of the Tsarist regime made up all these stories about the Jews doing it, or made up stories about the US secretly sponsoring the Bolsheviks or something. And I was able to trace it to the point where I say, oh, that's clearly propaganda, right? So I can dump that aspect of pluralism and condense it. Now, in that condensation, all the pluralisms arise of like, was the motivation this or that, and so on. But it's very exciting to me when I'm able to condense. So I just wonder what you think of that as a principal thing, that the movement away from, but it could of course be that I've simplified, right? And I'm actually not doing this wonderfully smart thing, I think, and I've like regressed. Now, there's reasons why I don't think I've done that, but do you see what I'm saying, Tim? There's a
I
challenge in
absolutely
moving out
do.
of
I
pluralism.
absolutely do. So I mean, this is really interesting philosophical conversation. I mean, these are deep philosophical issues. So I would say that that I would like to avoid relativism, which is the idea that there's all these different views and they're all just equally valid because they're all just views. I think that is completely wrong for all sorts of reasons we can discuss. But I also think that being able to see things from many different perspectives allows you to, well, how else would you choose which one you think is more valuable, unless you can do that? And then sometimes you don't know. I'm aware of two or three different ideas about the nature of gravity, but I don't know what the truth is. I'm not a physicist. I know the ideas kind of, and that's enough for me. And I don't have an opinion on it. There's other things, and this is the idea I had of paralogical thinking, where things that seem to be contradictory aren't contradictory. If you can take another perspective. Now, it's not you just hold them both and go, well, contradiction's fine. I don't think contradiction's fine. I think contradiction is a sign of weakness in the ideational network, and it will come back and bite you probably at some point because you believe two things, one of which can't be right. But you can see that there are places where you go, oh, but from a greater perspective than both, or a different perspective of both, they do fit together. I mean, the simple example I always use when I'm trying to explain this to folks is, if you take the map of the Underground in London and the map of the street, and they look like, well, they're not like each other at all. They're not even describing the same reality. But if you understand what they are, they describe exactly the same reality, and they fit together perfectly. You just need to be able to understand how they fit together, which is to do with schematics and all the rest of it, and purpose. And so I think that's very valuable. And then but the thing that draws me, I think, is the idea that you're looking for, what by truth I mean trustworthy. That's the root of the word for me. That's the etymology of it. I'm looking for what's the most trustworthy way of understanding this mysterious business I'm in. If there's a contradiction, there's something wrong. And the model for that is very simply, for me, it's just think about justice. Just think about a court of law. It's like, well, you need to do your best to find out what's the most plausible thing that happened. And it's not easy, and sometimes you don't know. And if you don't know, then just go, let's not judge. But if you can, you need to be able to go, no, they're innocent, no, they're guilty. And if you've got a contradiction, unless there's a higher order way in which you go, oh, this is how they fit together, then something's wrong. And and therefore you need to push it if you want to find the truth. You want to find what is trustworthy. And that's worthwhile. Now, not everyone needs to do it like I do it, obsessively every day now. But what we do is we specialize. So there are a group of people who do it every day, like me. And if we come up with anything of value, we'll put that out, and then people will go, oh, that's really good. Thank you. That's really helped me put these things together in a way they didn't fit together before, and that's what moves culture on.
Okay, great. I think I'll ask you now
Does that make
about
sense to you,
it.
Richard?
Does, yeah. No, I think it addresses the problem that I think we need to be reflective about when we're condensing pluralism into one thing, or and also when we're resting in pluralism, because it could be a kind of relativism that does not acknowledge any kind of underpinning truth there's at least in principle there to
Well,
access.
you can. I mean, a great example would be, take two systems that work incredibly well, like quantum physics and relativity physics. They're both brilliant. They don't fit, or Newtonian physics. It's like they don't fit together, but they all work. And so you'd be stupid not to use them because they work. But if you are at the leading edge of physics, you're looking for which one is right, or is it neither of them? Are we missing? What that's showing you is, because the universe is a unity, because it is a system in which things all work together, what are the thing we're missing in the way we're understanding this? And the whole way our ideation has improved so much so that now we're talking on the internet, whereas our ancestors were living in caves, is because we've done that.
Yeah,
And that's what we should continue to
yeah.
do, with
Well,
humility.
an example, you tell me if this is in line with what you're thinking. So one of my interests is, I think people are drawn often to conspiracy theory because it seems to have strong predictive power at
Mm-hmm.
times, in terms of, if you look back over the past 20 or 30 years, and the amount of times David Icke and Alex Jones seem to be right and seem to be the people predicting the narrative. So why is that? And I don't think it's necessarily because they've got the details right, but I think if you zoom out far enough, there is an observable pattern to human society which a conspiracy ideation describes in some way more accurately than when you're zoomed in and looking at all the details, like you can't see the wood for the trees or something. So I think in a mythical sense, if you represent it that way, there could be a kind of truth there, although it doesn't work on the level of detail. So you could have a more structural analysis of why society does what it does, and a conspiracy analysis, and they both offer different kinds of value. But they are ultimately, if you had enough detail, you could condense it to one picture that describes more accurately what is actually going on. And some of my work is attempting to go into that condensing that offers like a truer description then, but
Mm-hmm.
whilst recognizing that when we don't have that, positions that contradict each other could potentially have value.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it entirely, and that's why I said, we do it with humility. It's like because, and one of the key things for me is having an open system, an open ideational system, so that you can evolve. So the thing you were describing of when you meet people and go, no, no, not that, this, usually that means closed system.
Mm.
It's something where I've arrived at this. It's a fundamentalist mindset, and that is, to me, a complete mistake. It's the opposite of what I'm interested in. It's the ability to hold anything up to question. It doesn't mean you don't end up thinking, well, this is the best I've found for sure, but that's just the best you found so far. And I really hope, I'd love it if it was true that I could articulate something in this pod book, this individualist philosophy, which could be of massive value to people, and they could see the power and beauty of it as I do, in the way that it integrates spirituality and the understanding of physics and biology into one simple narrative of evolutionary emergence. But I haven't got any illusions, or I mean, it'd be nuts to think, well, I've got it. This is it. It's like, no, this will be, of course, if it's of any value, it will be for a limited amount of time. And then another generation will come along and go, look, it's missed this, or what about doing this? And then the whole thing will move again. Of course it will. It will keep changing.
I'd like to not go where I was going to go actually, and just stretch this a little bit further, because I think it's interesting to put this to you. It took me a lot of time to both see and cultivate an ability to think pluralistically to the extent I have, and to know, and I think in terms of when I'm podcasting, what I bring to it as a skill set, I think is really rooted in the this experience of consciousness, this experience, what I would terms like non-duality, the stuff I did with you, and over those years of an ability to have that pneumatic initiation of stepping back into something that feels like pure awareness and away from the ideas, because ideas are very bright and they're captivating. They shine brightly and you get drawn into them. We get attached to them. We go, oh, this is wonderful. This must be true. And an ability to take a breath and sink into a place where you can then go into another idea and say, oh, this one's very captivating as well. So I saw, particularly in reading Paul Feyerabend, the science philosopher, who described how why scientific views are incommensurable, how scientists talk past each other, how anyone describe it could be art critics talk past each other because they're locked into different views of reality. And I thought, okay, what transcends that is this perennial philosophy, is this idea that we can become witnesses of these internal experiences. Um, and I find this idea arises in different forms. Like Donald Winnicott, the developmental psychologist, talked about people forming obviously attachments to things when they don't have strong parental bonds. And he said, oh, ideas can be like an attachment as well. Like
Mm.
if you don't have a, which I root it back to be like if you lack a kind of core sense of self, then there's more of an attraction to some kind of fundamentalism, because my very self is rooted in this belief being true, and I have to hold on to it and defend it now. And I wonder two things about your intellectual process then, Tim. One would be, do you feel it's been a cultivation to not become so strongly attached to ideas that you can be playful and move around them? And do you feel that is linked to your inner spiritual process, the cultivation of an awareness of consciousness, however you'd phrase it, that has doing this kind of work in Advaita or Zen or in the Christian monastery has allowed you to be the philosopher you are when you come into an intellectual sphere?
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully put. Yeah. Beautifully put. Yeah. Absolutely right. So that pluralism was where I started. And that ability to move between different ways of seeing it and be fine with it was a good foundation for me. Now, but what's interesting is that I would now describe what I'm doing differently to the way you described it, which is the way I would have described it.
Yeah.
So I would have said also, I come into the presence of consciousness and I can see myself, and therefore I'm able to doubt my conditioning or my ideas and see things in new ways. And what I was encouraging people to do when they would come to me was I would deliberately bring them into mystery, so they were outside their ideas, and that enabled them then to change their ideas if they wanted to. And I would say exactly the same thing now, except I would see it in an evolutionary pattern, which I think works a lot better, which is that the psyche is looking at itself, but it's looking at itself from a more emergent vantage point, so that the witnessing isn't something outside the whole system. It's yourself. It is what the more common sense for you, really, that I am viewing myself, but I'm viewing myself from a more emergent aspect of my psyche, so I can see the ideas. And that enables then the whole system to make choices. And that's what's happening with every choice. So would you like tea or coffee? It's like somehow I have to look at those two possibilities, tea, coffee, I think coffee, or whatever it is. And we're doing that all the time. And it's, in a sense, paralogical. That's the paralogical thinking. We've got two possibilities and we're holding them both. Which is it? From a higher vantage point. Everyone does that. What you learn to do as you evolve, I think, the ability to witness yourself, is you can do that with more foundational ideas, like ideas you didn't know you had about the nature of reality, ideas you picked up either in your early conditioning, or ideas you picked up from the books you've read, and then you can stand back and go, yeah, that idea, materialism, idealism, and then you're doing that from that place. But the description of what you're doing is also part of the ideas you have. And so for me now it's witnessing, but no witness. There's no thing called the witness. There's nothing outside. I'm witnessing it. Tim, as a psychobiological system, is witnessing itself, and it can learn to witness itself on more emergent levels. And as it does that, it can evolve and make deeper choices. And that's what I've been doing.
Okay, then that's quite an interesting transition, because it's a transition between questioning things that you are witnessing and questioning the nature of the thing that is witnessing. So it's
Yes,
like another level of,
exactly right. Exactly right. And that's what happened, was that this was working for me. And then I started to go, is that right? Is there a thing called consciousness? And then it went from something which I was experiencing, therefore must be true, to that's kind of a crazy idea, actually. You know, there's this thing called conscious. Is that right? Isn't that a reification? Isn't that a making a thing of something which is actually an activity? I've got caught up into this very archaic idea, which I've taken in because I read it in books and heard it said by people with who seem to have some authority, and it worked. That's why it worked. And then actually, does it? And then there's better ways, and ways that didn't take away the experience, but recast it in a new light, which actually has been a better experience. I would say my spiritual
Okay.
journey has been better for it.
To try and understand that, one way I thought to ask about it would be to contrast what you're doing with atheistic or theistic or idealist or materialist position.
Yeah,
So if I take the time period from the Big Bang, a little before that if you want, wherever you like,
yeah,
up until the first thing in the universe that you could call the arisal of consciousness, right? So
yeah.
just that point, chop everything off after that, whatever that is, 2-3 billion years ago. Do you have any fundamental disagreements with an atheistic position? Right? Let's say you happen to be sitting next to Richard Dawkins on the train one day, and we're discussing that period of time. I think it's
No,
okay.
I don't.
Like you don't, right? Well, that's quick. Then next question.
No, I mean, and I have huge respect for Richard Dawkins because I think he is still fighting the Enlightenment battle against the mythic understanding of the universe. And I think he's a very clear thinker. My disagreements with him, which would still be there for that period, actually, is that Richard's, as I understand him, I don't want to misquote him, but is a reductionist. And I am absolutely not. So the difference between what I'm saying and, say, someone like Richard or a materialist, although that's such an old-fashioned position, I don't think anyone's a materialist anymore, but a physicalist, a naturalist, whatever you want to call them, is that I think the transition that happened, it looks to me like we went, and you mentioned this earlier actually, is that we went from pre the scientific revolution, the explanation was all top down. So God's doing it. Who's running the universe? God is. It's all predetermined by God. It's all, that's what's really running things. And then after the scientific revolution had run its course for a little while, that flipped, and it was all coming from the bottom. It's all just physics. There's laws of physics, and that, or to begin with, of course, the transition point, which is interesting, was that God is running it via the laws of physics. That was the transition that was made, was God created the laws of morality, and he also created the laws of the universe, and the laws of the universe run everything, and you're just running, and that's the way they are. They're decreed, and we know what they are, Newton's shown what they are, and off they go. And that gave us everything from the bottom up. And the next step for me will be not that. So that there's an emergent universe, everything is part of one process of forming. Everything is one process of forming, from the simplest thing you can see, which is the differentiation of 1 into 2, right the way through up into us having this conversation. And the higher levels are just as real and just as causally effective as the lower levels. Everything is interacting with everything else, all these different levels of this one process of forming. And that process of forming, which is the basis of a naturalistic vision of what the universe is, continues into the psyche, the soul. And if we can understand that, just like biology has there's biocausality, it does stuff, and it there's the reading of the universe on the level of biology. It can sense things, and it's an ecology. It's not just one thing. It's a whole ecology of many different things. Same as with the psyche. That the psyche is reading things. There's a sensing, a psi sensing. There's a psychocausality. It does things. It's doing it now. It's making my hands move and my mouth move. But it can also affect things in ways that are seemingly magical. It affects things on a narrative level. And it's an ecology of many, many different psyches interacting. And if you can get that, all the things that spirituality have been exploring, from what happens after death to the nature of shamanism, everything, becomes understandable within one process. And I would
Okay.
love to sit down with Richard Dawkins and see what he made of that.
So let's imagine you sit down with Richard Dawkins. Okay, you've talked about the origins of the universe to the first point consciousness arises, and it's all going good. There's no substantial discussion. I'm quite almost. I was expecting a longer explanation or a longer answer to that. It was just no, I don't. It's very good, right? Because that's clear, and we can move on. Um, so then, okay, I suppose I should really also say the arising of life. Maybe that's a point where a disagreement could arise, and then the arising
Yes,
of consciousness, whether you put those relative to each other. So at some point, there is a disagreement with Richard Dawkins
yes.
arises. Where on the timeline would you? Is it the arising of life? Is it to do with consciousness? Is it where do you think that the
Well, I
disagreement
think it probably slides
starts
in, to
in?
be honest with you,
Yeah.
because I am willing. See, because I'm, for instance, with physics, I have particular, I'm attracted to the physicists who understand things um, as relational, because that fits with my philosophy very well. I'm attracted to the understanding that it's probabilistic, because that fits very much with what I'm saying. Others don't. I like those. I'm very attracted to the physicists who are finally starting to say, hang on, the laws of nature, what are they? Where do they come from? So to understand them as part of the forming and as evolutionary rather than given. But otherwise, I don't know. I don't know. I'll leave string theory to them, because I'm concerned with spirituality, really. Same with biology. My sense is, look, something like Darwinian evolution is happening. We're beginning to understand epigenetics. I'm very interested in the cognitive approaches that are beginning to emerge, that actually it isn't just determined by genetics. It's actually, you can understand even cells as cognitive entities that are affecting genetics, and so that the whole thing is more complex and more interesting and more top down and less bottom up than we've been led to believe. I think once you get the arising of psyche, which is happening in the animal world before the human world, that can be influencing what's happening in evolution. So in other words, it's like there's a whole lot of nuance there, but overall some form of biological evolution clearly seems to have happened to me. So then the big jump becomes, the psyche is not just a little bubble around the head as a byproduct of the brain. It's a whole level of information. And what's interesting to me about someone like Daniel Dennett, who's obviously part of the was one of the four horsemen, I believe, with Richard Dawkins, another brilliant man, dead now, so he'll know if I'm right or wrong. And or no, he won't. He'll only know if I'm right. He won't know if I'm wrong, because he won't know anything. So Daniel, who I love, he's a brilliant mind. He will go, look, the psyche cannot be reduced to the brain. It is information on another level. He's been very clear about that. What I'm doing is I'm going, yeah, and if you understand the ontology in this different way, which none of them are doing really, apart from people like Sheldrake and a couple of physicists, if you understand it as the accumulation of the past, if you understand all that, you start to see the universe in this expanding information. You can start to make credible the idea that although the psyche has arisen as part of the psychobiological system, it can continue without the biological part, and that's perfectly reasonable and makes perfect sense. And then you've just opened up an understanding of the survival of the soul and things which Richard Dawkins, as I heard him recently, actually going, look, when asked about what happens after death, and go, it's just impossible to survive death. It's just impossible. And that's the view. That's the closed view there. Now, I understand why he's got it, but that it's impossible means I can't see any other way of seeing this which would make that plausible. And what I want to do is go, well, here's a way of seeing it that I think does make it plausible. And once you make that step, you can then understand all of this phenomena, which otherwise you're just dismissing and going, yeah, that's just crazy shit that people, that's just religion. And instead you go, no, this is actually part of reality. That's what I'm trying to say. This is real.
Would you say it's the case that this is radical in that I think most science types who have stepped into either the psi world or the near-death experience world and done very good scientific, I think, very good scientific work on that in
Yeah.
documenting it, have tended to have a metaphysical shift into a more idealist worldview
Yes.
as a way of explaining that. I think probably specifically because of this difficulty of the idea that a material brain can give rise to a conscious experience that can outlive the material brain. So then it must be the case then that consciousness comes first and it forms the brain in some way, or consciousness is like the TV signal that's being, and then when you break the TV set, it doesn't mean the signal goes away, something like that. There are
Yes.
always these analogies I hear, and I have to say I find that very difficult myself to imagine. A few years ago, I looked at the whole brain science thing and the correlates of consciousness, and I could see why materialists are materialists. Okay, in the sense that it is so compelling when you see that you can almost have dream cameras now, right, in a very sort of infancy stage, because the correlates are so strong that you know if this particular neuron is firing, that means it's some kind of animal that's moving from left to right. So you can have a representation of what people are dreaming about, or you can put a chip in someone's head who has a kind of paralysis, and they can start writing on a keyboard through the microchip. I mean, that's just incredible. And
Isn't
yet,
it?
there very obviously also is, to me anyway, it seems that the whole realm of consciousness, when you're giving rise to things that aren't in the material realm, like color, for example, the whole conscious experience, it's another order of existence to the material world. So, yeah, I suppose just to back up there a bit, it is that idea. What do you see that as a controversial idea that you're advancing? That
Yeah, for sure.
consciousness could,
I'm my whole problem, Richard, and it's something which I'm so familiar with. It goes back, it's not the first time, but is that uh, the people that I'm most allied to, what's been interesting is that I was absolutely embraced by a community which I'm not anymore, because I'm questioning the fundamental dogma which they see as the solution to bringing science and spirituality together. And I think, and I did too, and I now think is fundamentally mistaken. And it's because we don't want to go back to that. We need to go forward to something new. And I think there's ways we can understand it. So the key idea there is the one I've touched on very briefly, which is what I call passivity. It's the idea, and this is developed from ideas with Rupert Sheldrake, which go back to Charles Sanders Peirce and people like that, which is, and it's now, there was a brilliant paper called The Autodidactic Universe, published by 12 physicists, which are beginning to explore this as well. That was quite recently, which is that the universe is learning, or what we call learning is there happening right from the start on very simplistic, simpler ways, and it will become what we call learning. That it's developing patterns that repeat, but it's always creative, and that those patterns that repeat are what runs the universe. So that if you Minkowski's idea of space-time, the block universe idea of which I hate actually, of Albert Einstein, which is, look, there's not just the dimensions for space, there's the dimension of time, and it exists. So they've got it like, well, it all just exists, and that's so it's a commonplace in physics that the past exists, and for most of them, often the future exists because they're determinists. Now you take away the determinism, and you're left with the past exists because that's happened, but the future is open-ended because it's creative. And then you've got a four-dimensional universe. There's a deep time to this. And the analogy for me would be like, and this is only an analogy, obviously, and it's got problems, would be like I'm looking at you right now on my computer on Zoom. And what I see is you in the Zoom square. But what's behind that in the computer is this vast array of algorithms that are making it all happen. And that the universe is like that. That if you were in the room with me, you'd meet me, but behind that, in the to use David Bohm's notion, it's the implicate order, which is what you see as the explicate, and that's what's running things. And then to use the Zoom analogy, what I'm saying with death, and this is just a way of getting it quickly for folks. It's no more than that. But if I'm watching you now and your sound cuts out, but I can still see you, I'm not going to go, but that's impossible. That's impossible. I can see you but not hear you. I'm going to think, oh, part of the system stopped working. And I'm not going to go, Yeah, but we learned how to convey sound decades before we could do visuals. How could we see the visuals but not the sound? It's like, because it's a complex system, and it's perfectly possible that this part of the system stops working and the other part carries on working. The part that's doing the visuals, it's operating with pixels and blah, blah, blah. The other part is operating with vibrating speakers. And like that with the psychobiological organism. The biological part of the organism is running how the cells function and all the stuff that's happening with my biology. And then the psycho part of the psychobiological organism is dealing with all of my imaginal experience, all of the ideational processing, everything that's happening in the psyche. And they are completely linked. And the brain is the interface, which is why I can make my hand move up and down. But it's also why you can hit me and I go, oh, and I can have ideas from it. It's all one system. But part of the system can stop and the system can still continue. Now, it didn't start like that. I think it's evolved to do that. It's worked out a way, just like it worked out a way to do everything, to see, to listen. It worked out a way to sense. And then it worked out a way that could do that to such an extent that the level of the psyche is so evolved, it can still function. And then it's functioning in its own ecology. And then you've got the bardos or the spirit realm or the spiritual dimension or the Aluna, all these different names for what people have been exploring forever, because it's actually there. And it's where people can still have experiences after death. And it's where they can form into a communion, which is what we call God. So all of those things become possible if you have that ontology. And all I'm providing really is just like the beginnings of going, this seems plausible to me. Do you think we could work on this and start to understand how things function? And it explains the laws of nature, which otherwise have no explanation. It explores why things are habitual, but why they're also creative. And it's all to do with relationality. It's all to do with the one in relationship to itself as all these different systems.
Okay. I'm just slightly aware of the time, and we should maybe start to aim towards an end. So I'm going to limit myself to one more question.
How much of that made sense first?
It makes sense so if I understand it correctly, the people have these experiences of particularly near-death experiences, after-death communication, psi experiences, and you're accepting the validity of some sort of core of that the scientific work that's been done on that, as well as the spiritual experiences, that it's valid. It's not the wish-fulfilling fantasies of a dying brain. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the accurate position to take. Whereas the materialist reductionists reject that. They know it's just wish fulfillment. There's reasons they come up with. And I can see why that's compelling, because it so looks like they've got the brain almost figured out in terms of the correlates. I can see why it's compelling.
Let me just share with you one thing. Then this is a formative experience for me. 23. Maybe 22, studying psychology alongside philosophy at university, going to an extra lesson with the head of department, Dr. Ivor Pladle-Pierce, who had just been to a meeting with the 12 most senior neuropsychologists in Britain, and came back and shared this information that would be then printed in I want to say Nature, but I don't think it is, one of the big journals, and has since been, caused of someone with hydrocephalus, which meant that inside his head was a tiny bit of cortex and the rest is liquid. No brain, in effect, next to no brain, who had just got a first at Sheffield University. And now we've got lots of these. 50% of the people that are like this seem to be can't function at all. Others really well, including having a first in maths.
Yeah.
So clearly what we're understanding is not quite what we think we're understanding. Now, that doesn't dismiss what we're understanding, because it's fantastic. But it's like there's more going on here than our current assumptions, is what I'm trying to say. And the binding memory is going up to Ivor afterwards and going, "Did you say what I thought you said?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he just smiled and went, "It means everything I've taught you is rubbish."
Yes.
And that made a big impression on me. So we still haven't, I've still got past that. So something more is going on. And this enables me to have more of an insight to what that might be.
So I get that. So the materialist would try and jump through hoops to explain that in terms of how if enough of the brain is doing this or that, it can still do da 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 da.
Yeah.
But the idea,
It's very tiny.
yes, but where you're the distinction is, it's not like what the story you've just told me is revelatory if you were to listen to podcasts or read books by people into spirituality and science, okay? Because
Right.
they were all trying to understand how consciousness functions when it really looks like it should be dependent on the brain, but it seems
Yes.
to function without the brain. In the
Yes.
way that if you run a drill through your hard disk and you turn on the computer and it still works, suddenly everything you thought you knew about laptops is wrong. Okay, it's like there's something else going on there. And then the where the science, that whole cutting edge stuff has tended to go, is that, oh, it's because of the internet, right? So the laptop is really just this, as the hard disk is just this way of storing localized information, but the laptop can tap into this great field directly. And that field is what's fundamentally real. And the laptop itself is forming itself out of that field. Okay. So the idea of that condition and talking about that kind of thing in spiritual circles is not maybe the radical part of your work. The radical part
No.
is the flipping on its head of how
Yes.
do we understand that then? And it's not the
Yes.
way the materials are saying it, but it's not the way the majority of people involved in psychic research and near-death experience research are saying it either. That the
Correct.
materialists are sort of right in their conception of uh, how the biological system comes about, but they're wrong in the idea that the consciousness cannot then transcend from that place.
Yes.
And
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I'm going, look, there is an elegance and power to this evolutionary model. And so let's go with it. Instead of jumping to, well, there's no other option but to go back to the idealism, it must all exist in the mind of God or whatever it is, which is what I did. What about, let's explore, let's think about this a bit first. Maybe there's other ways of understanding this. And maybe this way of understanding time and the accumulation of information can allow us to understand how things can function, how they function at all, and can allow us also to see how that field that you're talking about, the level of the psyche, is itself evolutionary, that it's all evolutionary, and that enables everything to be part of this one. There's nothing outside. There's nothing supernatural. It's all natural. It's just that what the picture that naturalism has is it goes up to the body and then there's some funny side effect, rather than, no, it just carries on. It carries on. And this is the most emergent level, which is why spirituality is so compulsive. So the key thing with what I'm producing now, I would say, is what we need to take us forward is a form of spirituality that could only exist after the scientific revolution. It's not about incorporating two things, which would let, science and spirituality, there they are. No, it's about going, look, there's one process of us understanding. There was a revolution in the way we understood, which we call science. And now we can understand spirituality and bring it back in an utterly different way that could only exist after this had happened. This enables this new understanding. And that's why the other ideas are about going back to some pre-scientific understanding.
okay, the final question I'm going to limit myself to, because I think there's a lot I could ask about that. But do you see any fundamental problems that you butt up against, that all philosophy butts up against, where you get into unanswerable difficulties? And one example I'll lay out of that is, okay, we could take an example of like a flower and a seed, and the flower comes from the seed, and the seed is this simple little thing that sits in the palm of your hand, but then it can shoot out a root structure and blossom into this thing that contains color and shape and geometric form. But all the information to create that was present in the seed. So the question that I come up against and find to be unanswerable goes back right to the very origin point of the universe or existence, in that it seems like we can simplify things down and see everything evolving from a simple point. But that simple point, that in that moment of the Big Bang, the potential was there for color to exist. The potential was there for love to exist, for opera, for art to come into being. So that Big Bang moment must be this most intensely informationally dense moment, because it also contains the potential for all the things we don't yet know going on a billion years into the future of the universe. So that's this incredible level of complexity. And a theistic explanation of that is maybe to put something more complex behind that and say, okay, that's because that's God did it, which I accept philosophically doesn't get you anywhere. But I don't know what philosophically does get you anywhere in explaining just the existence of this intense complexity. It seems to me to be there's something like fundamentally unanswerable about that. So that would be my example of something that I butt against, and I think I don't know if this I could resolve that in a million lifetimes. It might be there's something that's fundamentally just can't get to around that. So with that example, maybe you take on that one, or maybe you think there's another example for you. There's something that like, oh, here's the real limit of where I'm going, and that's the Rubicon I cannot cross.
Well, I've constantly done that. That's why it's been this 8 years, and that's one of them, the one you mentioned. Um, what's happened for me is that every time that's happened, I've gone, okay, so that's, I can remember saying to people who are following my work, well, that's just off the map. The map's very, very big already. We'll leave that off the map. And then it's not off the map. That actually I felt compelled to go into it. And the more, if I'm willing to put in the days and days and days and days that are necessary to see where's the idea that's wrong here, I found things. Now it's all still on a very, what I'm doing is philosophy, so it's very big picture. But fundamentally, so for instance, on the thing that you're wrestling with, I think it's completely a mistake to understand about the nature of potentiality, that you're seeing potentiality as a thing, as something. I don't think that's, so I would say get rid of that word, talk about it as it could possibly be kind of anything. So it's more like you've got a sheet of paper, you could write on it, anything on it, but it's not complete, doesn't contain every picture already. It's just an empty sheet of paper. It doesn't contain anything, but it could contain all of these different things. And so if you've got something if you've got a process which is of differentiation of information, so and you're looking at that and going, okay, so the most simple form of that is the one becoming two. And when the one is not becoming two, it doesn't exist because it would have no differentiation. So that you've got a fundamental of going, look, the simplest thing you can get it down to is the one becoming two, not the one that somehow miraculously becomes two, but the one becoming two. The process of emergence is what the nature of reality is. It's the realization of new possibilities all the time. And the simplest one is that. And that you've got something way before the Big Bang, emergently, not temporally, because time is going to emerge as something as well. Space is going to emerge. Everything is going to emerge in this process of the differentiation of the one. And what can you say about the one? It has no qualities except for existing. It exists. It is. And it is because it's being differentiated. So that there's no dense information. That there's a very, it's like the opposite. But it's not simple. It's simple, but within that. If you think about entropy, for instance, which is one of the echoes that this is going to have later on, it's that simple arrangements, duality, will diversify into complex relationships. That is entropy. That's what entropy is. And it's right there, way before energy, just in the metaphysics of the one in the process of differentiating into two. And so you haven't got any of those problems, actually, I don't think, now. But I did think that for a while and wrestled with it exactly because I kept on thinking it's the potentiality for everything, but that must be huge. But I think that's just a mistaken way of thinking about what a potentiality is. That, it's potential of my hand to form a fist, but there's not a secret fist hiding in my hand. It just means that I can arrange things in this way or that way.
So I'm struggling to follow that, to be honest. The potential for opera is present at the beginning of
But that's a mistaken way of thinking of it. I suggest It's not that there's a thing called the potential of opera which exists at the beginning. What exists at the beginning is nothing. But if you've got something which can differentiate, it can differentiate into anything. It hasn't. It hasn't got all those little potentials in it. That's just a mistaken way of thinking about what a potential is. A potential is something which doesn't exist, but from your perspective, could or did exist because it's arrived. But it is not there. It's not like I said, the sheet of paper does not contain the potential to have, there's not every drawing sitting on it's somehow hidden in the piece of paper. It's just an empty piece of paper. I don't think these potentials are things. They're a way of talking about the fact that something can develop into something else.
Okay.
Without, from our perspective, seeing there being a limit to that.
I'm going to leave that as one for maybe people to comment on in the audience, because otherwise we're going to be sat here for me having brain freeze for 10 minutes as I think about it. So I don't think I'm quite up to, posting that or anything today. So I think that's, it's an hour and 20 minutes or so now, Tim. I think we're good for, is there anything else you'd like to say for today? Or
Well, there's a lot, isn't there? But yeah, fascinating to get questions which I don't normally get asked, and hopefully my answers have been somewhat coherent, both in terms of my own development, which is always interesting and an honor to be asked about and to try and recapture and see how this arrived for me, and a kind of mystery, Richard, which is, the experience is still so important to me. And I still love to share that with people and to see that moment where the love just goes poof, and you'll become part of this greater thing. And yet I have sacrificed that for these ideas. I have. If I'd spent the last 8 years focusing on that for myself, it would be a much nicer experience than what I've chosen. And if I'd chosen to go around the world sharing it with other people, I'd shared it with many more people. I wouldn't have become a hermit. And yet something at this stage, this late stage in my life, I kind of wish it was earlier, so I was younger. But at this late stage in my life, it feels so important, and I don't know whether it will be or whatever, but it feels subjectively to me like, oh, this is the thing I must do before I die, to try and articulate a completely different understanding of the reality of spiritual experience. And the fact that the more I push all those boundaries that you've mentioned, the better it seems to get to me. And the more the longer I spent trying to articulate it, I get slowly better at being able to say it in a way like the thing I just did with potentiality. Hard to get, because it's like, how do you hang these things in a way that people can go, oh, got it? Because if you're seeing it in a different way, that's not easy. I get that. So what I'm working on constantly is to create an overall narrative that people can go, oh, I see that, and then they can test it out. But that requires an invitation to have an open system when you're listening, to go, oh, could it be that the way I'm seeing it now, there's a better way? Maybe not. And then it comes down to, on the deep level, like do you want tea or do you want coffee? It's that pluralism which you found is so powerful. It's like, okay, here's your ideas so far. Hold them there. You don't have to do anything with them. There they are. Here's a new way of seeing it, which will seem strange and might have to work out a bit. But if you can get to the point where you can see them both, then you can make a judgment. And that allows your system then to evolve. And either you'll go, no, this is it. I'm still with what I had before. Or there's at least bits of this that you want. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. I think there's a lot I left off the table. I was quite interested to talk about morality and the evolution of ethics. So that didn't come into it. I think what you brought up about Marxism could actually link to that potentially, and how you would see that project you had of trying to map the spiritual onto the political from this. So there's lots of areas we could go. Maybe people can suggest some. If you'd like to do this again sometime, I'd be
yes,
very
because
up for that.
The irony for me, Richard, as I think you're aware, is that it's not just on these areas my ideas have changed radically. They've changed radically at the same time in nearly every area. It's been part of the same process that here I am in my 60s with the whole thing going, whoa. And yet, where I've ended up seems so much better than where I've spent my rest of my life, which is kind of wonderful, exciting, and also a bit strange, because it's like, oh, okay, right. wow, I missed all of this. So yes, politically as well, how we deal things socially, ethically, all these areas, they all fit together. And it's another reason why it's taken me so long, is because for myself, I want to understand how all of that fits together. Not just like science and spirituality. Like, no, everything. How does everything, at least in principle, fit together? Because then you have an overall map or picture which you can home in on and go, well, there's a specialist bit here. Let's look at that, which I can't do. But that's what the job of philosophy is. And again, it's not to arrive at some ultimate truth. That's ridiculous. It's just to find something better than what we've got so far.
Tim, thank you.